your camera. So Brandy Payne, turn off your camera. Awesome, thank you. Just so that everyone can give their attention to the person who is speaking. All right, let's kick it off.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. Kevin J. Vaughn, Director for Planning and Development Review. I'm going to kick us off here today, and Brian, if you could just help out with advancing the slides. I just wanted to thank everyone for participating today. This is the first of 3 sessions that we'll have, and I'll get into those in a moment. So today's agenda, we're going to talk basically a summary of the 3 zoning changes, spend some time going over community engagement and feedback that we've received. We'll provide some draft recommendations for each of the 3 changes, and then have opportunities for discussion as well. So part of this process is, although being led by the Department of Planning and Development Review, because ultimately we help support the Planning Commission and City Council when it comes to the zoning ordinance. We've been very intentional about involving a number of city departments to get their feedback, because as we know, changes to the built environment also have impacts on other areas of our community. So not only us, but economic development, housing community development, human services, finance, public works, the city attorney, and the CAO's office have all been playing an active role in discussing and drafting alternatives for these changes. So an overview on this. This started with basically 3 resolutions, one through City Council, Resolution 2021 RO27, and that was directing us to look at eliminating parking space minimums. The other 2 came through resolutions from the City Planning Commission, and those were to permit accessory dwelling units in all residential districts, and to revise short-term rental regulations, looking at some of the difficulties with administration and enforcement of the ones that are currently in the ordinance right now. So the timeline, where we've been, where we're at, and where we're moving forward. So phase 1, we started this in late summer and provided an overall view of the 3 zoning changes, discussing what they were, and decided to bring them together because they do have some impacts upon each other. And so we did a number of engagement methods, from in-person meetings to Teams meetings like this. We did some telephone town halls. We've had open and online survey, trying to contact as many members as we can, those who were involved in the Richmond 300 process. And we then moved forward and had some focus groups in September and October of this year. Different groups, generally 8 to 10 people, facilitated some structured conversations, really to get into some of the nuances of changes to these ordinances, and get specific recommendations or concerns from members across our community. So these focus groups were intended to bring together diverse perspectives and have some structured conversation on how we could move forward, again, with some ideas and concerns. We'll be issuing a focus group report that can kind of put together some of the summaries of those groups, and that can be shared with the group. We can discuss that in a moment. Right now, what we're going through is our draft concepts. And so based on the initial outreach, the widespread outreach, the focus groups, we are presenting a place to start the discussions about what ultimately may be proposed in legislation. And so it's a starting point for concepts, listing some policy alternatives. And we're going through another round of engagement, again, through multiple methods here, a virtual meeting. Today, there's one later this week. We'll be having an in-person meeting next week. There's another survey that's been opened, and again, communicating with our widespread network. So we'll also have a report on this to share a summary of what we learned from this round of engagement. And then after that, early next year, we will start drafting ordinances to look at what is going to be potentially proposed and voted on by City Planning Commission and City Council. As we've mentioned throughout the process, these papers will all be taken individually. So there will be one for parking, there will be one for accessory dwelling units, and there will be one for short-term rentals. We may continue some conversations with overlapping some of the content, but ultimately there will be 3 independent papers because there are 3 different sections of the zoning ordinance and will be considered independently. So just a little bit more about some of the engagement that we've done so far with our meetings, our telephone town halls, and focus groups. We've had approximately 740 people attending these public meetings. Again, there may be some overlap as people attended multiple, and we've had so far the survey 562 responses. All right. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague. And again, just some housekeeping, if you can ask, if you are not speaking, just to please turn off your camera, help save some of our bandwidth and focus on the presentation here. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to planner Brian Mercer.
Thank you, Kevin. My name is Brian Mercer. I'm a planner here in the Department of Planning and Development Review. And the first zoning change we're going to talk about today is eliminating parking space minimums. And before I get started, I just want to provide a brief history of how these parking requirements came about in the city of Richmond and where we are today. We know that Richmond has been around for quite some time, but it wasn't until the late 1920s until we saw the first city zoning ordinance. And at that time, there was no reference to any parking requirements. It was pretty much dividing up the city into residential, commercial, and industrial zones. But then over time, as the zoning ordinance was amended, it's in 1943, that's when you start to see the first off-street parking requirements. And it wasn't all across the city. It was mostly like if you're building a 2-family dwelling, you have to provide 1 parking space in the carriage house or only certain commercial zoning districts. But it's really not until the 1960s when cars became really common and popular, where you see to the right here that the zoning ordinance created a separate section and it listed all the uses and then what the off-street parking requirement would be for these uses. So really over the past 60 years, the zoning ordinance has had this type of chart for the off-street parking requirements. And then looking at where we are today, this is the section of the zoning ordinance that provides that chart that I talked about. And typically for residential uses, it's based on the number of dwelling units, while commercial use minimums are often determined by floor area. Not every commercial use is determined by floor area. There are some exceptions, but typically that's what you're looking at. So restaurant, one parking space per 100 square feet of floor area. And then just over time, we've looked at areas throughout the city where maybe the parking requirement doesn't need to be as strict as, instead of 1 per 100, maybe it's 1 per 300. And even other parts of the city like Carytown, West Brooklyn Park Boulevard, where maybe parking may not be required for certain uses. And then as I'll get into more, we have the complexity of non-conforming or grandfathered spaces. So a lot of uses that were established prior to these parking requirements coming in, because in the 1960s, obviously, we have a lot of building and uses that were constructed prior to that. How do we deal with these non-conforming parking spaces? And also over time, we've created these zoning districts, a lot of downtown and the new transit-oriented nodal districts, so the TOD1 that we see along portions of Broad Street, where we say that no off-street parking is required except for dwelling uses, hotels, and motels. So it's really just been decades in the makings of how we've adjusted these parking requirements depending on the location in the city. And for the initial outreach, we asked the questions, what are some challenges with eliminating parking space minimums, but also what are some opportunities? And here's just a very high level overview of what we've heard in regards to challenges, talking about better public transit, the potential for overcrowding of street parking. It could deter businesses away from the city and impact the existing infrastructure with the increased density, but also realizing that there is a better use of land than surface parking and potentially parking in general. And there's studies out there that show how requiring parking can increase the cost of housing, and then being less reliant on cars can also reduce the environmental impact, and also just the administrative burden getting, whether it's special approval or just the research and time that's involved, especially for these small businesses, because the large corporations with the money, they can pay for the parking. That can be very expensive, but it's really those small businesses that these can really impact. So our staff draft recommendation is to eliminate the parking space minimum requirements from the city zoning ordinance. Again, I don't want to cause any confusion. This is not saying that we are prohibiting any parking or we are actively going out and getting rid of parking spaces. This is pretty much saying that this chart in the zoning ordinance, we are recommending that the zoning ordinance does not dictate the number of parking requirements based on these uses that we've been doing for over 60 years now. So I just wanted to clear that up, because I know in the initial outreach there's confusion that we're not going to allow for any parking. If somebody wants to come in and they provide the parking based on their business or the residential, that's fine by us. It's just we will not dictate the minimum number that they have to provide. And this is just off street. This doesn't count anything with on street related parking. Some more draft recommendations in addition, talking about implementing the following initiatives, and some of them we're continuing, but expanding the transit system. I know within the past few years we've had the west to east pulse route, but now we're also looking at a north to south route as well. And we've seen a lot of new bicycle lanes coming in throughout the city. And one of the concerns we've heard is about those residential districts that are near commercial and having that all on-street parking spill over into the residential districts. So we have some existing parking permit programs, but how we can revise those and maybe implement more to help with that potential issue. And also looking at promote shared parking. So every business or development may not have to have the exact amount or the right amount of parking on that parcel. Maybe there's ways, if it maybe in Scotts-Dishon, or I know we're looking at the Diamond District and City Center, how if you're visiting, you can just park in one location, walk around, see everything you need to see, and then leave from there. So, and then some uses, maybe an office use that it's not being used during the weekend, you can use that for residential. So it's just really promoting that shared parking space. So not every parcel has to have their own on-site parking space. And then one of the big concerns we heard was the assessing curbside time limits. So we've heard concerns people are parking too close to the intersection or they're parking illegally. So how can we better enforce that? So that's where we can bring in other departments as well. So for these 3 zoning changes, we're looking at Richmond 300 as our guide to how do we implement these 3 zoning changes with this new document that we created 2 years ago. And really this proposed zoning change touches all of these topic visions in Richmond 300. So high quality places, how do we really not put emphasis on surface parking in cars and create these network of nodes, these places that people really enjoy to be, or enjoy to visit, like as I mentioned before, Carytown, that was built prior to any cars. Then also equitable transportation. So really putting that focus on the movement of people instead of vehicles. So looking at other ways, as we talked about the pulse and bicycle lanes, and how we can encourage people to use other modes of transportation. And then also the diverse economy. I talked about having the small businesses in the city of Richmond and how these parking requirements can really deter people from starting a business or just delay the process. So we want to have the small businesses and the large businesses throughout the city. And I talked about it before, the inclusive housing, how parking can increase the cost of housing. And we know that there's a affordable housing issue in the city. So how can this proposed zoning change help with that? And then, as I talked about again, the thriving environment increasing the cars and prioritizing the cars over public transportation or other modes of transportation. If we can do that, it can really help the environment as well. So when we look at this zoning change, we're looking at all these topic visions of Richmond 300 and how this proposed change can help it. So a little more rationale for why we're looking at pursuing this zoning change. I gave you a very brief history of how the parking requirements have been, but we've done decades of incremental parking changes, and it still remains very onerous and complicated. I could get into many examples of how there's been complicated previous approvals and things of that nature, but and I know for our new zoning ordinance rewrite, we're talking about making it easy for the public to understand and not requiring a lawyer to do all this work for you. But the way our regulations are now and just the history, the zoning districts, the non-conforming parking spaces, it can really be complicated. And even for lawyers who are well versed in these zoning ordinances, it can really be difficult to understand. So eliminating parking space minimums would make it less complicated. I've spoke about the multimodal aspect of it, and also the cost savings for businesses and housing, but also really just to encourage the redevelopment of surface parking lots. Here we have a picture of an entire block in the heart of downtown where back in the 80s and 90s, when we put the focus on the vehicles, we got, I wouldn't say stuck, we have these large parking lots right in the core of downtown. So, and I know the Dominion Tower, they built a lot of underground parking, so it frees up a lot of these surface parking lots. So just not having that parking requirement can really help redevelop some of these surface lots that we're seeing downtown Monroe Ward and other parts of the city. So I just wanted to provide one example of these non-conforming parking spaces. Here we have the intersection of West Cary and Laurel Street. We have a restaurant use that has been established well before the 1956 parking requirements. So what we do is we look at the use when it was established and over time if it changed at all, and we assign what the current parking lot or off-street parking requirements are to this building. So this building right here has 23 non-conforming parking spaces associated with the use in the building. So these non-conforming spaces, they don't physically exist. There's nowhere. They're just tracked and on previous approvals. And then if this was to change from a restaurant at 1 per 100 to retail 1 per 300, they would lose those grandfathered parking spaces, the difference. And then if they wanted to come back and make it a restaurant again, they would have to get special approval because once the non-conforming parking spaces are gone, they're gone forever, and you have to get special approval to do it again. So even though this use is permitted in the zoning district, if we wanted to build this today, it would either require 23 off-street parking spaces or a special use permit. So this is just one of the many, many, many examples of how the complexity of the non-conforming parking spaces, of these parking spaces that hypothetically exist, or they don't physically exist, but they're just from previous approvals. And then speaking of special use permits, we looked at one of these larger developments that required a special use permit because they weren't providing the parking requirement determined by the zoning ordinance. This SUP was submitted in January 2021. Not much any opposition. It got approved in September 2021. So 8 months later, we know in the development community, 8 months is a long time, and just having that delay can really hinder business in the city. And so this required 1 parking space per dwelling unit, but they looked and determined that maybe this location, they don't need 1 parking space per dwelling unit. So they provided 70 parking spaces, but then also 38 bicycle parking spaces. So just looking at other modes of transportation. And even though if this building was located 2 blocks south in the TOD1, it would be permitted by right because the zoning requirement is 1 per 2 dwelling units in the TOD1, whereas in the B7, it's 1 per dwelling unit. So this is just an example I wanted to show of how the special use permit can delay the time for these projects, and how maybe it makes more sense for these developers to determine what the location and what parking would be required on their end. And during the initial outreach, we heard that we want to support small businesses. People are okay with that, but it's really the large developers that they're concerned that they're going to be greedy. They're not going to pay for the parking. So what we did was we looked at 50 different residential, commercial, and mixed use developments that are either existing today, they're approved and under construction, or they're in the pipeline for approval, just as in many different zoning districts, just to see like what we required and what was provided, to see if that concern that these developers are not going to provide any parking actually happened. And what we found was that roughly 4,700 were required, but they provided over 12,600 spaces. So in excess of over 7,800 parking spaces of these 50 developments that we noticed. So I guess we wanted to show that there's that concern that someone's going to build a 300 unit building and provide no parking, but they have a separate process in order to get financing with the banks to show that their parking requirement makes sense for that location. So that's all I had for that zoning change. I think we'll take a little time to do a little Q&A.
Yeah, let's do some questions. Raise your hand. We'll do like 3 or 4 questions, and I want to keep it more to questions rather than comments at this moment. Any questions about eliminating parking minimums? Boz.
Sure. Just a general question, I guess. I've heard of rezoning efforts in the city, and maybe that's like 2 years away. Do we feel like there's so much of an immediate need that we need to go through this process now? Or would this be eliminated, the need be eliminated through the rezoning?
That's a good question. This process was kind of initiated by a council member by resolution, and so now we're bringing it forward. The rezoning process will commence. We'll be issuing the request for proposals to get a consultant on board next year in 2023. But we think that we can make this change now, even without a rewrite to the zoning ordinance. Kevin, anything to add?
Yeah, I think part of it was these changes, even though we're looking at a comprehensive rewrite, these are 3 significant sections that we'll deal with anyway. Ultimately, I mean, council will decide whether they want to take them ahead of this or during the rewrite piece. But I think from a practical perspective, looking at this right now, per the council person that introduced this, this could be something that could stand separate from the whole ordinance rewrite. In terms of, I think, as proposed, it looks at all the districts and citywide versus a district by district approach. And so our recommendation would be to, as stated, eliminate and move forward with this ahead of that. But ultimately, Planning Commission and council will make that decision.
Rebecca?
Hi, good afternoon. I'm wondering why the consideration for residential is included in the same discussion as commercial. Why are they not being looked at separately, like homes, for example?
Why are they not? Because we think that the wholesale elimination overall, that we don't think that there's necessarily, we don't really think that there's when it relates to parking and providing off-street parking, or requiring off-street dedicated parking in the zoning ordinance, that we need to differentiate on that matter. Kevin?
Oh.
Yeah, I think, as we talk about large scale and small scale, and both different types of commercial and residential, I think the same premise applies. As we worked on our research for the small scale, it often is, cost prohibitive or will even, impede redevelopment or development of a site at that smaller scale because so much room physically has to be dedicated towards parking. And what do? You do that at the expense of being able to provide housing, not only in terms of space, but also in terms of cost. And then so we looked at, concerns that were brought up about larger scale developments from a residential perspective is that, you'll put in 100, 200 units and then not provide any parking whatsoever. And then you'll have a negative impact on surrounding properties. And based on, research in other communities and also right here, I mean, looking at our own projects, we have found that those projects have actually provided an oversupply of parking than what was even recommended to the tune of 3 times. And so I think, one of the things that we look at also overall in terms of just the housing crisis that we're in as a city, the balance of, the usability of space, and that is the physical space that's dedicated towards housing people versus the space that's dedicated towards storing cars on a property is a concern. But then also, from an affordability perspective, it's not cheap to create a parking space. To create a paved space and create a structured space is even more. And so looking at ways that this also helps our goals in terms of moving housing forward in the city and affordable housing as well.
And last question on this topic, Councilwoman Jordan.
Well, I'll be darned. I had a question myself. I guess the council goes first, or we just keep on listening.
She raised her hand. And
I'm happy to defer to the caller. Thank you.
Okay, I forgot about people who were on the phone, and I had seen her hand raised. So why don't you go ahead? I forgot that we had people just on the phone. So you can unmute. I think it's *6, and then we'll go to Councilwoman Jordan, and then we'll move on to the next topic. There's a comment form on our website that you can put in comments. This isn't the only time to be able to talk about things.
Yeah, I know all that, but that's not what you said. The other thing was before that. There, y'all go get y'all backdoor stuff.
Okay, I would love to hear your question. Can you, ma'am?
Yes. My question is the same as the other ladies. Why is there no differential between commercial and resident, but there's 2 different names? There's residential and commercial. They're there for a reason. And then later on, we're going to go back and we're going to say, oh, not a problem. We'll bring someone in. We'll pay them to say, oh, look at this. This is what we're going to do when we do the rezoning and reviewing. That's BS.
Okay. Thank you.
So what?
I think, sure,
Kevin,
just
anything
to
yeah.
reiterate, the point that we looked at in terms of, I think we did, look at that all categories, and we talk about residential, we talk about commercial, we talk about manufacturing. I mean, we talk about all the different functions that the land has here, and we found in terms of proposing that putting forth some of these minimums is negative in each of those categories, and maybe in different ways, but the impact is the same ultimately for different types of uses and functions in the city.
Yes. Councilwoman Jordan?
Thank you. My question was regarding shared parking. I mean, I think that's something that we hope can be enacted, obviously, but just practically, what other localities have you seen that have been able to be successful with normalizing shared parking or formalizing it more? Because I know in our district, we've had businesses request assistance getting a shared parking arrangement with nearby, larger businesses. And the response we got was that it was not worth the hassle and that they were not going to do it. So how can we create that as a winning path across the city? And what have you seen other localities do?
I'll take one piece of that. Right now, with the requirements that the city imposes, if you're looking at trying to meet your parking requirements through shared parking, you need a private agreement between the 2 entities, but that agreement actually has to be reviewed by our city attorney's office. And so sometimes going through that and the process of doing that can be cumbersome. If we eliminate the requirements, then it takes us out of it and really just becomes a private business to business or person to person transaction that they can decide the terms and conditions that don't have to get vetted by us. So I think that is one thing of getting a layer of lawyers out of it that helps the market and individuals decide, how to price and how to structure those agreements. And then I also think just in terms of communication and uses as projects move forward, really looking at I'll call Venn diagrams of when uses are best shared. And we had some of these conversations, I think, with the Diamond District, and one of the challenges is entertainment, sporting uses with residential uses. Generally, people are both there in the evening, and so there's not a lot of overlap. But if you look at maybe a 9-to-5 office or places of worship and assembly with residential uses, then there's more overlap whatsoever. So I think, providing some information about where, kind of the general times, where's parking not used and when could it be used by somebody else? Those are things that we as the city could help with in terms of providing that education. I don't know, Brian, was there anything more perhaps on that?
No, it's well said. Due to time, I'll keep it at that.
Great, thank you. Let's move on.
Thank you.
Let's move on. Again, if there's other questions, we'll have some more time at the end for the other topics, but we want to move on for all topics, but for general Q&A, but we'll move on to accessory dwelling units. Take it away, Brian.
All right, so the next zoning change we're going to talk about today is permitting accessory dwelling units. For those of you who are not familiar, an accessory dwelling unit is just a smaller independent dwelling unit located on the same lot as another residential structure. So you have to have a place for eating, sleeping, and sanitation. So it has to have a full bath and a little kitchenette. Doesn't have to be a big kitchen, but then a place for sleeping. So these also have other names known as accessory apartments, in-law suites, or granny flats. So that's just what a high-level overview of what these are. And a lot of us think about ADUs as in the top left here, that it's either your garage, your separate structure in the back that you convert to an ADU. But there's many other different types of ADUs, as you can see here on the chart. You could do an addition, you could do a basement, a garage conversion. So I really wanted to include this slide just to show that there's many other different types other than just that accessory structure in your backyard. So these are all the different types that we researched. During the feedback period that we heard from the public was, I think overall it was pretty supportive of allowing these accessory dwelling units by right. And some of the things that we heard about regulations as far as size, setback and height requirements, potentially design standards, short-term rental regulations, and even occupancy. But after we just got the survey, we were just is encouraging to see that we had the support for these ADUs. So our staff draft recommendation is to permit one accessory dwelling unit by right on the same property as a single-family dwelling in all zoning districts that permit single-family dwellings. So as you see here on the map, all the areas in orange are zoning districts that permit single-family dwellings. So it could be a single-family detached or a single-family attached dwelling. But our recommendation is that if you have a single-family dwelling, that you could do an ADU, whether it's internal, attached, or detached. Another one of the recommendations, in order for this to truly be accessory, we had to figure out some sort of regulation in regards to size in order for it to be accessory, because building a single family dwelling on the same lot as a single family dwelling, just really, how do we create that accessory use? So our proposal is that the ADU, whether it's internal, attached, or detached, it can't exceed 1/3 of the floor area of the single family dwelling, or 500 square feet, whichever is greater. So then if you only have a smaller house that's 1,000 square feet, you can get up the 500 square feet. We thought that was a good recommendation of something that could be an independent ADU. But so just really looking at the size of the main single family dwelling, of how to allow for this. And if this is something that you can't meet the underlying zoning requirements, then there's always special approval either through the Board of Zoning Appeals or special use permit through City Council. So these are just the 3 draft recommendations we have, whether the location of the ADU, the size, and then just you have to meet the underlying zoning district requirements depending on the location. So if you wanted to build a bigger one that doesn't meet these, special use permit or BZA approval. And there's a lot of research out there because these ADUs have been around for quite some time, but one of the main benefits we saw was that it was a place for an aging parent to stay or an on-site home for a full-time caregiver. And it's a way for empty nesters to downsize instead of having to move away. And it can be more affordable than a full-sized home, and it can provide an additional source of income for the property owner. Throughout the Richmond 300 process, we heard about ADUs very often, and we heard about them so much that they're specifically referenced in the Richmond 300, that ADUs should be a primary land use in residential and neighborhood mixed use future land use categories. They should be allowed by right with form-based requirements, looking at the size, the setbacks, the height. So that's where our recommendations in regards to the form-based requirements. And in Richmond 300, it talks about one of the benefits I just mentioned, allowing people to age in place within their neighborhoods and not having to move away. So that was pretty quick. We can talk about it a little more, but just wanted to throw those recommendations out there and see any initial questions or thoughts on that.
Awesome. Thank you, Brian. Let's start with the people on the phone since I forgot them before. If you are on the phone and you have a question, please unmute by pressing *6 or unmute your phone. All right, go ahead.
This is Christine again. I don't have a question, but a comment. I think it's a very great idea. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Christine. Next, someone else unmuted?
Yeah, are you allowed to have multiple ADUs on the property?
We would say that you can have one accessory unit per single family parcel. Another question?
And I just think that, just sort of clarity, what we're proposing is a recommendation that would allow this by right. And so it's an administrative process. You file applications. If you, as this, Brian said, if you would like additional units or you need to vary the zoning ordinance, there's other paths to do that are legislative and have public comment with them. This is by right, that just like a regular building permit for your house, you would come in and file and go through an administrative list of check boxes to go through to get this done.
Okay.
Thanks for that clarity. Another question on the phone?
My question is for all of these proposals, is this something that the public could vote on?
So for all of these, it doesn't go to referendum. It would be, an ordinance would be introduced at City Council, and City Planning Commission would vote on it, and City Council would vote on it. And then we'll do one more phone. I saw a 757-918 number.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. My question is, you just talked about the process being applying for a building permit just like you would with a normal single-family home. If someone wants to do a short-term rental with their accessory dwelling unit, would they then have to also, in addition, go through the process of the short-term rental? Is that correct?
That's a great question, and yes, that is correct. You would have to get a permit for the short-term rental use.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, now on to people who are on their computers. Joe Gelbach.
Hey, yes, thanks. This might be a wheezy question, but in terms of following the underlying zoning, when it comes to lot coverage, I'm just thinking about builders now, really building out to the max of their lot coverage. is that something that you foresee as a barrier in terms of the proliferation of units that already are taking up the max lot coverage?
You know, I think it just might mean that the accessory dwelling unit would have to be interior to that building rather than a granny flat, like a carriage house.
That makes perfect sense. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and a lot coverage issue can go to the Board of Zoning Appeals. So that's roughly a month and a half to maybe 2 month process, whereas in a special use permit, as we saw, can be several months. So that is one way. And also lot coverage, as we talked about, the zoning ordinance rewrite, because I know there's parts of the city now that have lot coverage that doesn't really line up with the lot sizes in that area. So especially like just south of Carytown, you have lot coverage of 35%, but it's very small lots. So that's the lot coverage issue, maybe something we do later on with the zoning ordinance rewrite. But in the meantime, if you can't meet the lot coverage, you can go to the Board of Zoning Appeals.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, guys.
Okay. Robert?
Thank you. I just wanted to quickly thank Brian and all those involved here for involving us. We really appreciate being able to have a voice at the table here. My question was around the height restrictions and requirements. Have any specifics been told there? It may be similar to the previous question where you know, that might have to be looked at by a board, by the city council, but I was just wondering if any of those restrictions had been put in place yet.
Brian, can you talk about the height? How
Yep.
height regulated?
So right now in the zoning ordinance, an accessory structure, so whether it's your garage or it's an ADU, there's a height limit of 20 feet if it's completely detached from the main dwelling. If it's attached to the main dwelling, then it would just be the height limit of that zoning district for the main building. So typically in your residential districts, it's 35 feet is the height limit. So if it's attached to the main building, it can go up to 35 feet. But if it's detached, it's 20 feet. And then the measurement is depending on the roof type and things of that nature. So that's something where if you have to exceed the height limit for this, it would be a special use permit and not if it's in the R1 through R8.
Understood. Thank you, Brian.
And then Emily, last question.
Hi, thank you. I am curious if the department has considered incentivizing affordable rental of ADUs in any way, or if it's possible for when, you know, I'm not sure how this would be possible, but yeah, if it's possible to incentivize affordable rental of ADUs through this permitting process.
I'll take a jump. Yes, we've discussed it. And yes, it is quite complicated. And so we haven't come forth with any particular proposal yet. I think one of the questions is about, I'll just say administration and enforcement. And that is, yes, we would like to get additional housing units and to gear them towards those, you know, who could afford them. The question would be, you know, what would be, if any, financial incentives, and then tracking to make sure that that rent is affordable and long term. And so that would involve some collaboration with our other departments. I think at this point right now, we are just looking at this, I'll say from a built environment supply side of just providing units, with depending on what ultimately is adopted, following that with some additional conversations about affordability and increasing things for affordability. I think one of the things that we talk about, just maybe hopefully naturally, is that our goal is to really rely on that term accessory. And that is the accessory unit is smaller than de minimis of the primary unit. And so generally, when you have something that's smaller, it in nature is more affordable. And our hope is, you know, as units come on, you know, we don't build enough smaller units. And so with these being smaller, you know, 500 square feet or a third of the floor area, we're hoping that naturally provides some affordability. But if not, we are having and have had discussions about other incentives to provide an affordable level of rent or ownership even.
Thank you.
Sure.
I want to move on to the final topic. We will go a little past 1 o'clock for everyone who's on the call and worried about making sure that they are able to ask questions about the STR regulations. We will be going past 1. Joshua Rogers.
Hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Just a quick question, or the 500 square feet, that's not the maximum, correct? So if your house is say 2,100 square feet, you could go up to 700. Am I seeing that correctly?
Yes, that's how we drafted it at the moment.
All right, perfect. And thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's move on to the next topic, which I will tackle, and that's to revise short-term rental regulations. So just to remind everyone, a short-term rental is like Airbnb, HomeAway, or Vrbo. The Code of Virginia defines it as renting a place for fewer than 30 consecutive days. Our current STR regulations were adopted in 2019 after about a year or more of engagement, and it's permitted as a short-term rental. When I say STR, I'm using the shorter abbreviation, is a accessory use permitted in any zoning district that permits residential uses. So that means it's not just in our districts, but in any zoning district that allows residential uses. The current regulations say that you have to be a property, it has to be your primary residence in order for someone to get an STR permit, that it could be the entire dwelling unit or individual rooms, but you can't rent more than 5 individual rooms, 5 rooms, or can't be larger than 5 rooms, and that you must have a permit every other year. One of the things that when that was adopted, the city agreed to review the regulations after they had been in place, and so that is why we are here today. Some of the feedback we got, there's a bunch of ideas of ways to revise the existing regulations and then some ways to improve the existing regulations. Some people said to remove the residency requirement, the primary residency requirement. Other people were said that it should stay. Some people said that you should limit how many there could be per neighborhood or how many one person could own, to have there be a tax on STRs. Right now, the short-term rental, the city does not collect hotel tax, but now we are enabled by the legislation to collect hotel tax, to not allow them at all anywhere, some people said, and then some people said not to allow them in certain places. Other ways to kind of improve it was to streamline the permit process. So there's ideas of like how to verify that it's your primary residency, reducing the permit fee, which is right now $300 every 2 years, increasing staffing, requiring inspections of the units, and then having there be more involvement with the short-term rental operator companies rather, who in some cities they're getting close to having agreements with the short-term rental operators or companies rather on them providing data to the cities. So our draft recommendations fall into a lot of different buckets. This is a little bit complex, and it's draft. So just like before, these are draft. We're looking for people's comments before we actually bring an ordinance to council. So there are recommendations related to location and residency. So we are proposing that in a residential district, if it is your primary residence, it is permitted. You are permitted to have a short-term rental as an accessory use. And if the building is not your primary residence, we're saying that it could be permitted as long as you are not within a certain distance of other non-primary residence short-term rentals. So this is the distance, the exact distance would increase based on the zoning district. So in zoning districts where parcel sizes are rather large, the distance would be greater. So you wouldn't be able to have one, let's say, within 500 feet of another short-term rental. And then in districts where the parcels are smaller, the distance would be smaller. And then in a non-residential zoning district, they would be permitted in if it's your primary residence, and if it's not your primary residence, it would also be permitted. However, if you go to the next slide, for multi-family buildings that are in those non-residential districts, so that would be like your TOD1 or your B4 where there's apartment buildings, B7, B5. For multi-family buildings, only 1/3 of the units or a maximum of 10 units, whichever is fewer, would be permitted to be short-term rentals. If that multi-family building is in a residential district and it is not the primary residence of the owner, then that distance requirement would apply. So then you would only be able to do one unit, provided that there aren't there isn't another non-primary resident short-term rental within the distance. That's if it's in a residential district. We have recommendations related to the operations. So similar, these two are the same as before. We're carrying them through, that it's your entire dwelling unit or individual rooms, and that you can't double book a unit. And then there's administrative recommendations. We're keeping the permit fee, asking it to be obtained on a biennial basis, additional staffing for permitting and enforcement, adding a fine or penalty for non-compliance with a graduating increase for multiple violations. We had a phone call with Nashville. In Nashville, if someone does not have a permit and they find out that they do not have a permit, they are on the first offense, they are prohibited from operating the short-term rental for a full year. And on the second offense, they go to court and they get with the ultimate penalty of being 3 years of not being allowed to operate a short-term rental. We recommend that the city, or that rather that the platforms collect the transit occupancy tax, which is the hotel tax, and remit it to the city. General Assembly passed a law enabling that to happen, and that we also require an inspection for the short-term rental. This is all on our website. If you Google Richmond, or if you Google RVA Gov 3 zonings, you'll find it. So you can go back and see the recommendations to spend a little bit more time with it. The short-term rental regulation aligns with our goals of trying to increase tourism. It also aligns with our goals to preserve and expand housing. We heard a lot about people being worried of units that could be rental units being taken off the market and being operated as essentially hotels or permanently, and people also being concerned about their neighborhood becoming, a block of hotels when they were thinking they were moving into a fully residential neighborhood. And then we also heard that people like to travel to places and live and stay in the community and go to the local places that maybe they wouldn't go to if they were in more of a traditional hotel. So with the recommendations, we're trying to balance it. It is draft, and so we'll looking for more feedback and recommendations on it. And all of these recommendations will have some administration that we'll have to implement. People are probably like, how are you going to do that? Right now, we're trying to get feedback on the what, and then the how it gets implemented, we'll work on after we kind of get alignment on the what will change. The next slide just shows where short-term rentals are in the city as of January 2022, so almost a year ago, so it should get updated probably. And then I see some hands bumping up. I knew this would be a popular topic. So on the last slide, before we go into questions, I want to just go into next steps for people who might be hopping off at 1. We are having another one of these virtual meetings on Thursday at 6 p.m. And then we're going to have an in-person meeting. It's going to be the same exact content as what you just heard now. So if you want to hear it again, you can come to the main library and listen to that. Or if you have friends or other people who you think really need to hear it firsthand, please send them to that meeting. This is being recorded, so we will be posting the recording of this on our website as well. We have a public comment period from today to January. We have an online comment form where you can put your comments there. You can also email us your comments. Frankly, it's a little bit easier for us if you use the form, because that way it all comes into one place and it's easier for us to read it all and aggregate it. But if you email us, we'll read those too. We just kind of prefer the form. And then in January, starting in January, February, we'll start drafting some ordinances and submitting them to council. So with that, let's jump in and do a couple of virtual hands up, people who are in via the Microsoft Teams app, and then we'll do a couple on the phone. But before I do that, we'd love to hear how you think this meeting went. So this isn't a comment about the legislation, but rather if you think this meeting was a good meeting so we can make improvements as needed. If you go to bit.ly/3zeval, so that's bit.ly/3zeval, you can comment on how the meeting went and if you have any feedback on how we ran this meeting. So first we'll do 3 with their hands raised, and then we'll go to the phones. Thomas.
Hey, good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to mention 2 or 3 things. The first is Airbnb, I believe, is going to start remitting payments annually based on occupancy in the locality. And I believe that's set to pay out in January. Is the department already aware of this activity, and are there already arrangements on how that money is used?
I'm not aware that they were going to start sending us checks. So we'll get in touch with their lobbyist to learn more about that. And then, yes, all the hotel, the transient occupancy tax all goes to pay off the debt on the convention center. So the convention center was financed through the hotel tax from Hanover, Chesterfield, Henrico, and Richmond. And all 4 of those localities, their hotel occupancy tax first goes to the Convention Center Authority, who then pays off the debt, and whatever is left from after paying the debt goes back to the localities.
Correct. So if we use lodging tax, it goes that way. If you enact fees instead, you might be more likely to collect that revenue. But I have another meeting. Thank you for hosting, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you. Let's see, the next person is Sarah Wallace.
Hi, I just had a question about residency requirement. If that's removed, how are y'all going to prevent a bunch of out-of-state owners from purchasing, properties and running them as short-term rentals? And the reason I ask is because there already is one on my block that is doing that. And no one lives there. It's 3 apartment buildings in one house. And, since I live nearby, it concerns me if someone that's renting it, leaves the water running, leaves the gas on, I love the idea of Airbnbs. I'm not unsupportive of it. I just want to know how that's going to be taken care of. Thank you so much.
That's a good question and a really valid concern that we heard from a lot of people. And so right now in our draft recommendations, which again are draft and so could change based off of our conversations over the next month or so, in that scenario, that person would only be able to operate one of those 3 apartments as a short-term rental, provided that there are no other short-term rentals that are non-primary residency within a certain distance of it. So it would reduce the number in that scenario. We won't be able to control like who owns property, like where they live. That's something that we can't really mandate through zoning. Kevin, anything to add?
Yeah, I think to the point, yeah, we can't control the ownership piece, but what we can do is put other safeguards in place to address some of those concerns. So the distancing is one that's considered for non-owner occupied. The other will be as Maritza said, select the policy, looking at the administration, there's many localities that require to provide the city with one, if not two, individuals who can be reached 24 hours a day, who may be required to post information on the rental itself or on the exterior so that there's contact information there. You understand that it's a rental. So if somebody does have a concern, they have somebody to contact. So those are some of the administrative things that we don't necessarily have regulated right now, but would be considered as part of the administration and enforcement piece of this.
Great, thank you. Christy Mara, and then we'll move to the phones.
Hi, thank you all. This has been a really informative meeting. I appreciate it. I am one of the folks who's really concerned about the way that short-term rentals, not just here, but across the country, have contributed to the affordable rental housing shortage. And I think they clearly have in some way. If I'm understanding you correctly, the only fee that someone who is using their property as a short-term rental pays that isn't passed on to whoever their visitors are is the $300 biannual permit fee. And I'm wondering if there has been any thought given to an additional fee, whether it be an annual fee, a monthly fee, or my preference, a fee tied specifically to each occupancy by each different guest that would go directly into the City Housing Trust Fund.
Oh, interesting proposal. I'll write that down. So this is why it's good to have other people think things through. Kevin,
and I didn't introduce myself fully, but I'm the housing director at the Virginia Poverty Law Center and would love to work with you all on this if it does get any traction.
Thank you. I think in terms of, fees and revenues, we need to demonstrate that they're for a certain purpose, either to A, administer the ordinance, or B, like offset a potential negative impact. So information that we have that we can show, that there's a reasonable means for, collecting these fees and it's towards this purpose. Those will be things, again, as we kind of talk about in the back end with administration, to making sure we get those right and what's legally possible and not. But I think, yes, that we'd love to have some additional discussion about what might be possible with that. So thank you.
Great. Thank you. And I've got to jump off for another meeting, but thank you all.
Thank you. All right, let's go to the phones. Anyone on the phone, if you want to unmute, go ahead. 757.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So first, I wanted to thank you all for having this meeting and giving us a chance to, to speak on our concerns and things like that. I did also want to say that the person who talked about the short-term rentals on their block that are being operated by someone who's not an owner, if that is the case, then I definitely would encourage you to report those to the city. As I have had to do in my neighborhood as well, with a unit that was actually right next door to me. But my question is, what was the thinking behind potentially removing the owner occupancy requirement? Because as I understand it in previous meetings, there's already a huge problem with there's only a small percentage of the STRs being operated in Richmond are actually permitted, and others are being operated illegally without a permit. So removing this owner occupancy requirement is only going to make that problem worse. And in addition to, as one of the other people said, contributing to the to the rental housing crisis that they all over the country as well as in Richmond. So my question to you would be, what was the thinking behind removing that, and how are you going to ensure that we don't run into this issue, not just people from out of state or out of the country buying property and then turning into STRs, but also the fact that we already have people in the city that don't have a permit operating short-term rentals. If you take away the owner occupancy requirement, then that just opens the floodgates for more people to whether we're talking about single family homes or apartments, to turn those into short-term rentals. And there right now, it's very little penalty for them to prevent them from doing that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much for your comments. Kevin, can you speak to the trying to balance bringing people into compliance and what's happening and affordable housing and not ruining neighborhoods with too many short-term rentals?
Sure. As best I can. I think one of the things that we talked about and again with ADU and housing supply is having an adequate number of, either for ownership or for rental units available for broad segments of our population. And so, looking to add those with ADUs, and in some cases, we may take some off with a short-term rental. If somebody's using that for a guest who's here under 30 days, that it's not providing that housing for somebody who could be a longer-term resident. And so I think that is one of the things in terms of for those cases that do not have to be, for properties that do not have to be owner occupied, in what way can we limit them that's, I'll say, administratively possible and feasible. And so, in proposing, distancing requirements, we haven't really set a fixed number on what that distance would be right now. So some discussions about, okay, how far and how, far apart could they be? Because I think also, looking at some of the research and looking at, what's being provided right now in the market, it's not evenly distributed across the city, right? There's shown before kind of the swath, from the near West End through Church Hill, right? That most of these are clustered. There's not a lot beyond that. And so how do you look maybe specifically at these neighborhoods and looking at the balance of housing stock? In the same way, I think we also need to look at just from a market viability. There's a capacity for the number of short-term rentals that can exist in our market. And we are, it's great that we get tourism, but like everybody financially could not turn their home or come in and buy a property and turn it into a short-term rental and not live there. There's just not enough visitors to drive that. So it's getting a better understanding of what that market may be, to allow for it to exist in a way that can be regulated. But then also, as Maritza has talked about, we just need to do some more things with enforcement and being able to track it, and also, I'll say, make compliance much more of a straightforward issue. And the penalty for not complying is not just the cost of doing business, it's to get the compliance. And either you get permitted or you stop doing it. And I don't think we have that balance right now. So those are continued things that we'll work on as we refine this. And again, this is, I think, as we talked about, our starting point for conversation. And so we appreciate the feedback on what we're proposing.
All right.
I just wanted to clarify, was it the owner occupancy requirement being removed or thinking about being removed, or was it just the residential requirement? Meaning, can someone that rents a unit turn that into a short-term rental as a tenant themselves? Is that still going to be against the rules?
So as proposed, there's, I guess, kind of three segments. One is separating out short-term rentals in residential districts. So if you're an R1 through R8 district versus those in mixed-use districts, which we don't separate right now. And in the residential districts, still having an owner occupancy requirement, but also having an additional way to have an STR without being an owner, but with a bunch of other, I'll say, restrictions or limitations on how many there could be. Brian, is that an accurate way of saying that?
Yeah, I think that's, and I know some other cities, they allow tenants to rent out their space, but it has to get the primary or the property owner's authorization through an affidavit or something like that. So that's something we could look into, but regardless, it's going to require some form of property owner authorization. You can't just go behind the property owner's back and just rent it out. That wouldn't be allowed.
Okay, let's take a call from Barnes, a question rather.
Hi, thank you so much. Regarding the first recommendation, the distance between non-primary residents, STRs, is that essentially going to be like a race to get the permit? So, whoever, or it's 2 years, they're grandfathered in, but say that they're two folks operating, we don't know what the distance is, like those two people, it would just sort of be whoever gets their paperwork in first and filed first. There's not going to be any sort of additional vetting, or I guess kind of
No,
what's
that's a good question. We haven't kind of figured out that detail yet of how particularly that kind of race or not would happen. Maybe there would be some sort of lottery of people, we draw from a hat, whoever was compliant first. A lot of times people submit applications and they're incomplete. So it can't be when you submit, so we'll have to kind of iron that out. We didn't want to spend a lot of time figuring out those details if the policy was something that people objected to.
Sure. Thank you.
Thank you. Joshua Rogers.
Yeah, just a couple quick questions. So I believe that Airbnb has been collecting, occupancy tax in Richmond for the past, 5+ years. And so wondering, did the city just not get that money? But if they did, where has it gone? And then secondly, just what is the timing on these, what you're talking about, these changes in the zoning, both for the Airbnb and the ADU? Are you all planning on voting on something on this year, or is this kind of like a years-long process that we're going to be going through?
So not this year because it's almost over, but next in 2023, most likely what will happen is parking and accessory dwelling units will go sooner and short-term rentals will go a little bit later. We're hoping to get all of these introduced, maybe not all voted on, but certainly introduced by the middle of the year. And I say the short-term rentals might take a little bit longer because there's just more review from our attorneys and just kind of, it's a lot more detailed than the others.
And what about the money that Airbnb has collected?
I am not aware of them having remitted it to the city. We can check that with our finance department. But if let's say they did remit it to the city, which I don't think they did. I think they're probably just holding it. But if they did, it would be considered hotel tax and it would be paying off the Coliseum debt.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone on the phone have a question? Okay, we'll go back to the queue and Caitlin Almeida.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, I think someone already kind of asked this, but I was just curious if you would consider ratings or superhost status or how many reviews they have instead of just who applies first for these, the non-primary residents STRs. And it sounds like you guys haven't really discussed that.
No, we haven't. I mean, that might not be fair to people who are just starting out. Because that would assume that you've been operating without a permit for a while, and therefore that's how you got the status. Or maybe you have one, but you're not compliant or whatever. So, but we actually hadn't thought of that, and I hadn't heard of that from other localities in our research. Brian, had you heard of that?
No, and I guess these are going to be changes to the actual zoning ordinance. So there's going to be things that we have to incorporate in the zoning ordinance, and then there may be kind of a separate maybe SOP process that we have administratively of how we go about issuing these that may not necessarily be written in the zoning ordinance. But I guess in just like the last question, those are kind of might be more like in the details of if this is something that we want to pursue. We're kind of trying to get the high level policy down packed first, and then we'll pursue that. But that question, I imagine that would be something that we do administratively separate from the zoning ordinance.
Sure. Okay, cool. Yeah, also considering if they're actually a local host, I think Sarah mentioned that earlier, making sure that we're supporting local businesses and not people that live far away and just, want to have a bunch of LLCs here for every new house that they buy. I think that's pretty important to consider.
Thank you. Thank you for that feedback. Amelie?
Hi, thanks again. I have a kind of follow-up question to Christy Mara's suggestion. And I'm just wondering if it would be possible to scale the permitting fees. So if any occupancy taxes need to go to the Coliseum, perhaps there could be a yearly permitting fee to Airbnbs, in particular ones that are LLCs or are large developments. And then perhaps the fees could be scaled. So if, for example, if there is like a one-off ADU, like someone is just making an extra buck on a room, they pay a smaller permit fee compared with large developments that have, half of the units designated as Airbnbs. So I'm not sure if that's allowable by Dillon rule or by this zoning, but just something to consider, and wanted to uplift that those fees be put into the Affordable Housing Trust Fund also. So I guess both a question, is that possible, and a suggestion to make it possible.
I am not sure if it's possible. I think we have to investigate whether or not we can do that. But it's an interesting idea for us to look into. Julie? Julie, if you're speaking, you're muted, so unmute. All right, I'll come back to you, Julie. Anyone on the phone with a comment?
Yeah, I have a question. I was wondering, how did you come up with the idea of how many kind of per area and just the styles? Is something modeled after another community?
So the distance requirement was something that the American Planning Association said was kind of a practice that they noticed that a lot of cities, the different cities were doing, and was an idea that we pulled from them.
Okay, thank you.
You are welcome. Julie, were you able to unmute? Oh, you went
Yes.
off, so.
No?
Oh, okay.
Oh, sorry. I'm unmuted. Thank you again for the information today. I just have two questions as it relates to neighborhoods. And that is, number one, have you done any assessments of what the impact both of parking and of short-term rentals will have per neighborhood or per council district? Because there certainly are some neighborhoods, I think, that will be more significantly impacted by these than others. And secondly, and I know this because I've been in conversations quite a number of neighborhoods who are impressed that the Richmond 300 plan has been an award-winning plan. But there's tremendous amount of real concern about this inside neighborhood associations. Particularly thinking about parking, and particularly thinking about short-term rentals. And I'm wondering what is your outreach to those groups, and are you really listening to the concerns that they have?
So we have, Brian has emailed all of them that these meetings are happening. We hosted the focus groups that had people from all sorts of different neighborhoods. Sam from my office helped us kind of make a lot of diverse focus groups so that we had people represented from different parts of the city. So we've heard from, and that is all documented in our reports, which you can find on our website, of where people are coming from
So just, I would really, and have you done any assessment to look at what the impact has on individual neighborhoods and or inside council districts? There are some neighborhoods like around Virginia Union or Union Seminary or VCU who will be way more dramatically impacted by these than others. And so I think it's really important to understand, not just across the city, but in terms of the places where these rentals probably are going to proliferate, and parking is going to become crazy, to really understand what you think the potential impact is in those specific areas. And I really would request that you do some analysis of that.
So when we've done our analysis of parking and STRs, we are looking at the different types of districts, different parts of the city, kind of seeing what kind of developments are coming up. When Brian shared that slide about the parking, that's, you know, places that have been overparked, those are from all over different districts, different parts of the city. So we have been looking at different areas and looking in closely at them.
I guess it also depends on the traveler too, because sometimes someone who's traveling through short-term rentals, they'll drive there and there's concerns that people will come over and park their cars there. But then there's also times where people travel, they may fly in or take the train in and they don't even have a car to park. So I guess that's kind of analysis is hard to get, but just looking at there's many different types of STR renters out there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Martha?
Hi, yes. Continuing the neighborhood theme, rather than having one rule for residential districts citywide, would it be possible to have the distance required between two non-occupant STRs be determined on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis?
Yeah, so Martha, that's what we're thinking about. It might not be by neighborhood, it might be more by zoning district, which, you know, the zoning districts are kind of given by neighborhood. But so that the distance will be different, you know, if you're in Stratford Hills versus the Fan, there might be a different distance requirement, because if it was like 150 feet or 250 feet in the Fan versus Stratford Hills, it's really different because of how far apart the buildings are spaced in each one of those neighborhoods. So yeah, we're looking at it would be graduated scale.
That it sounds like neighborhoods would not particularly get any more voice in that.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well. Can you do that again?
But it sounds like neighborhoods would not get any more voice in deciding that than in the rest of the process.
Well, we haven't created that chart yet, so I mean, we want to see if the idea is like a plausible one before we kind of go into all of those details. And so we'll have to make more of the kind of administrative and ordinance details and then do some more outreach.
And typically the zoning district, the residential zoning district, the more dense residential zoning districts, those neighborhoods are similar to your less dense neighborhoods. So even though they're different neighborhoods, the zoning district typically gets a good gauge for the neighborhood feel. So.
Thank you.
And again, these are things that we have to enforce in the zoning ordinance. So we can reference in the zoning ordinance, oh, in R6, this is the requirement, but we can't reference, oh, in the Fan, the requirement's here, whereas in Stratford Hills, it's here. We have to kind of keep it consistent.
Yeah, we have to use the zoning districts because neighborhood boundaries change, and civic associations change their districts. So it's best to use the zoning ordinance districts for those determinations. This isn't necessarily like this round of community engagement, is it? There may need to be more discussions on certain aspects of these, you know, depending on the kind of comments we get now. A. Barnes, another question?
Yeah, this is really quick, and apologies to anyone that this doesn't affect, but specifically to the Fan area and the two parking restricted areas in the Fan. Have y'all put any consideration into how parking would affect the Airbnbs there? Because you have to get guest passes if you know you have a guest stay there and that sort of thing. Has there been thought that's gone into that yet?
Our current regulations don't speak to parking as it relates to short-term rentals.
The
So-
areas where there are already parking restrictions, it probably is something that needs to be considered. Otherwise, folks, if they're there, wouldn't really be able to park there. So just a thought.
Yeah, I mean, it might impact that Airbnb's ability to lease their space if they can't help their people find parking.
Okay, but it's not going to affect those people would still be required under the existing laws to get parking permits for their Airbnb guests.
I don't think so. I don't think there's current laws that require short-term rental operators to get guest passes for their.
If the cars are going to be in that area, basically, someone has to get a pass to be able. So say there's a guest, they have to have a pass to park their car there.
Yeah. I mean, they might have to do that because they want to do that as a short-term rental operator to be able to offer their person a parking spot, but it's not regulated legally by the zoning ordinance.
Got it. Yeah, I just basically want to make sure there's not going to be a whole influx of extra, cars. Thank you.
Understood. So I don't see any more hands or questions. I'm sure there's more that you guys will think of. That's why we have this comment period up until right after the new year. So this isn't the only time to provide feedback. Please fill out our meeting evaluation form to let us know how you thought the meeting went. It's bit.ly/3zeval. And you can go to our website. If you Google 3 zoning changes, RVA Gov, you'll find it. Please fill out the comment form, and we look forward to hearing more from all of you in the future. Brian, any other things to add?
Nope, that's it.
Great. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone. Brian, make sure to